Good morning. We've been talking a little bit about time, so I thought we'd talk about time and clocks this morning. What actually started this thought in my mind was I actually read an article about whether churches should have clocks in the sanctuary. I really didn't think that was a thing. However, we do have a clock. If you wanted to turn around, you could look at it. It looks something like that. And yes, that is a clock. I know some of you don't recognize it, but that is a clock. And some of us old people, when we were little, we learned how to read that clock. And we can actually look at it and tell you what time it is just by looking at that. We don't need the numbers. I know that's really weird, but that's true. Actually, I was watching election coverage in the States, and one of the reporters that was somewhere said that there was going to be more results coming in at the bottom of the hour. And the host of whatever show that it was on said, that phrase has always confused me. What do you mean by the bottom of the hour? And I won't tell you that it was Anderson Cooper, but don't want to embarrass him, but I'm going, what? The bottom, that's easy. It comes from this. When the big hand is at the top, that's the top of the hour. And when the big hand is at the bottom, that's the bottom of the hour. It seems simple to me. The little hand tells you what hour it is. So if it's the top of 2, the big hand would be up, and the little hand's at 2. And it just goes from there. But apparently it's not quite that easy. So the discussion was whether or not churches should have clocks in the sanctuary. And there's pros and cons. You want a clock in the sanctuary so the preacher doesn't get too long-winded, right? That's probably the pros. The cons is that, if God moves the preacher to keep preaching for a while, you don't want to interrupt that. Maybe you do, I don't know. And it all depends on what kind of culture you're from about how you feel about time in church. Most of you probably took, I'd guess, between 5 and 15 minutes. Some of you are a little bit more than that to get here this morning. So you're probably okay with a service that lasts an hour. We actually, we do have a time limit, actually. This is true. We try 75 minutes. I'm not saying we always make it, but 75 minutes is what we're aiming for. So 12:15 is what we're kind of aiming for. But, this is what we are. But if you're somewhere else, like China or something, you might have to take a train ride to get to church. Then you might have to walk a while. It might take you 3 hours to get to church. So if you're going to take 3 hours to get to church, you want a long sermon. You want it to make it worth your while. And so it's kind of culturally dependent. When I first came to Edmonton, I came here as a youth pastor. So I was hired by a church as a youth pastor to take care of the youth. I kind of moved into the associate pastor more role fairly quickly. Started to do some stuff on the worship team. And did some other stuff kind of around the church. And one guy that was there asked me if I would preach at basically a predominantly black church. And I said, sure, I'll preach. I said, if my boss will let me away on Sunday, I'll go there. And so he talked to my boss. My boss said, no problem. So I went to preach at this predominantly black church here in Edmonton. And there were some things that I had to understand. And the first was that the sermon at this church averages somewhere around the 2-hour mark. And I'm going, I can preach my sermon 2 or 3 times. I've never preached a 2-hour sermon before. I'm not sure what you want me to do there. But that's what this church was. So anyways, I was invited to go speak. So I went, Nelda and I both went down and we walked into the church. The first surprise for the church was that I was white. They didn't know when they were getting me to come that I was white. It's kind of hard to hide, So that was their first surprise. But church started at 11 o'clock. And there was some music. And then they did the announcements. The announcements were over half an hour long. Just the announcements. And then we got back into some more worship. And then it was time for me to speak. So I spoke probably did 45 minutes that morning. And then we did some more worship. And then we signed off the service. And then we went downstairs for a potluck. Apparently they do this every Sunday. They do a potluck. Everybody brings food. We all have this fellowship time together. So we were down there eating for a couple of hours, fellowshipping. And then guess what we did? We went back to church. Went back upstairs for another service. This one I wasn't speaking at. So we spent some more time in worship. But it was cultural. For them, coming to church was an all-day thing. They didn't expect to go home. I'm not sure how you'd feel about that. Stan's here lowering his head already. Goes, oh no, I want to get home. I don't know why he wants to get. I know he doesn't watch football, so I'm not sure what it is. But yeah, he points to his wife for football. But this is cultural. This is normally what they did. The church that I was pastoring at that point also had some issues with time. And one of our issues was the announcements. I don't know whether you realize it or not, but we do our announcements on video basically to get a handle on it so that we don't go a half hour. Can I tell you another secret? Our worship director, Greg, gets a little testy if we go over about 3 or 4 minutes, just so you know. And if we ever did over 5, I think he'd probably have a little bit of a cardiac arrest right there. He keeps on telling us how long we can go with announcements. But that's one way of handling it. This church that I was in, we didn't do that. We had somebody would come up every Sunday and do announcements, and he would do the normal announcements. And then you had somebody come up to do the special announcements. And they would come up, and I don't know why, but everybody who came up to plug some dinner that was happening or a play that was going to be performed felt like they had to tell a joke first. So they tell a joke, and then they tell you what was happening. Be sure you come out for Mission Society meeting tonight at 6:30. You'll be glad you came. And then the next person would come up, tell another joke, and then invite you to the Caribbean Association, concert that's going to be happening. And we did this every Sunday. And at one point, I went to my boss and I said, don't know whether you realize this or not, but people aren't listening to the announcements. Like, they're tuning it out. They get the first few, and then they get bored, and they start working on their shopping list or, playing crossword or something like that. They've checked out. And it takes so much work for the worship team to get them back into the service again. And he goes, yeah, I know. You know that nobody's listening. Yes. So why do we do announcements? And his answer flabbergasted me. We do announcements because it's important for the person giving the announcement to give the announcement. No communication is supposed to be happening here. That person is feeling important, and that's all this is all about. And I'm going, oh, okay. Sorry, I thought we were trying to communicate. And for that church, that was probably very true. But time is something that we just simply need to somehow get a hold of. This was drilled into me actually by my grandfather. My grandfather always talked about a contract that we have with you. And we have this contract that says that we will start at this time and we will finish at this time and get you home. We can change that contract if we want, but we have to set up these guidelines, and you have to do this. And so for him, it was unthinkable that if you had an 11 o'clock service, that it would start at 11:15. You've got a contract. You've got to start that service at 11 o'clock. I was talking with Emmanuel earlier this week. We actually had a bit of a wedding here on Friday. Emmanuel pastors the afternoon service, the African service. And so Emmanuel and I were talking about this whole idea. And if I get him right, and his brother is here somewhere, he can probably correct me. If I get what he's told me, he said that in African culture, it's not so much that you show up on time, but that you show up. So, okay, that makes sense. Because I've been to weddings. I told him, your wedding, for instance, where, it's supposed to start at 12 o'clock. And not all the guests shows up till 2. You've been there for 2 hours. There's still people coming in through the door because they know this is a 3 or 4 hour exercise and we don't want to be there for the whole thing. So we'll just come in for, the important part. But it's not when you show up. It's just that you show up. And again, that's cultural. That's a different idea of time. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit more about God's time. And I get that that can be a cop-out. I understand that. But just want to mention something. So we're going to be talking from Ecclesiastes 3:11. And this is the way that Qoheleth talks about this. He said, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end." So if you're trying to keep blanks, it's God's time. As I said, that can be a bit of a cop-out. We can say, well, it's in God's timing, right? So it's not happening when I want it to happen, but it's God's timing. We're gonna settle on God's timing. Everything might not look good right now, but this is in God's timing. God's hand. God will lead us. And maybe I've made a little bit too much about Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. And I keep on saying, that doesn't come to fruition until the generations later when they go back. But that doesn't mean that God wasn't there in his timing. He was there caring for people. And maybe the best example of this is a guy named Daniel. Remember the story of Daniel? Remember the lion's den? Yeah. He comes, and he's taken in one of the first exiles from Judah and taken into Babylon. But Daniel is an upright, God-fearing man, even as a kid. So he comes into this system, and they're offering him food that has been offered to an idol, and he says, I can't eat that. And he has three friends with him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You probably remember them from the fiery furnace. And they're all there together. And so the four of them say, well, we can't eat this. Can you just bring us some vegetables? And the person who's taking care of them says, well, no, because you're supposed to be healthy. If I just give you vegetables, you're not going to be healthy. Apparently they hadn't heard about vegetarians. Anyways, so they say, well, let's make a pact. Why don't you try it for a while? Just give us some vegetables and see how we look. And if we don't look good, then we'll eat your meat that's been sacrificed to idols. But we think everything's going to be okay. And they were. And so because Daniel was a God-fearing man, he started to rise in power in Babylon. He started to take positions of prestige in Babylon. And he gets to a point where he's high enough in the power that Nebuchadnezzar knows him. And then there's this incident where if you don't bow down and worship the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, you get thrown into the lion's den. And that was set up so that Daniel would fail it. And Daniel failed it. And Nebuchadnezzar had made this a rule that could not be undone. And so he had to throw Daniel into the lion's den. But then he fretted all night because this was Daniel. He didn't want to hurt Daniel. This had been a setup, and he was worried about Daniel. So the next morning, when morning breaks, first thing Nebuchadnezzar does is run to the lion's den to see what happened to Daniel. And Daniel's still sitting there going, hi, I'm here. The lions are okay. I'm okay. We're all just having a Bible study down here. And Nebuchadnezzar praises God. But God continually has his hand on Daniel. And then Nebuchadnezzar dies, and the reins of power are passed on to some sons and son-in-laws, grandson. And Daniel, because of who he is, retains that position even in the Babylonian government. He keeps positions of prestige. Now, he's not really high, but he's high enough. Until something happened at a party that King Belteshazzar was at. And here's how Daniel describes it. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. his face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. So this incident happens. Daniel's not there. The king's there with some of his friends. And this hand writes a message on the wall. And the message was, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Paris. Think how they pronounce that. And that had a meaning, but they didn't know what the meaning was. So finally somebody decides to bring Daniel, see if Daniel can decipher this. And Daniel comes in, he looks at the message, and he goes, yeah, I know what it says. But king, you ain't going to like it. Mene means that your days have been numbered. Tekel means that you have been weighed and measured and found wanting. Paris means that your kingdom is going to be taken from you and divided between the Medes and the Persians. This is not a good message, king. But Daniel tells. And Belteshazzar is so happy that he at least knows the message that he does this. Then Belshazzar command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. For years we struggled with that. Why third? I mean, when Joseph rose in power in Egypt, he became second. Why is it that Daniel just becomes third? And then we figured it out. Because King Belshazzar, was not a king. He was a prince. He never did reign in Babylon. It was his father that did. So his father was 1, Belshazzar was 2, Daniel was 3. But Daniel continued to minister, continued to be honored by God. It wasn't the full fruition of God's story becoming complete. It wasn't a return to Judah, which is what Daniel wanted. But God blessed him even in his time there. But that doesn't mean that Daniel had a nice ending to it. We actually don't know how Daniel died, but the traditional idea is that, and there's some problems with this, but the traditional thought is that Daniel was killed by Haman, who is the bad guy in the story of Esther. The struggle that we have is that really we think Esther happened later, so we'd have to move Esther a little bit backwards. Esther doesn't give us anything to date it, which is part of the struggle. We have to move it back so that the two can connect. But that's the traditional understanding, is that Daniel was killed by Haman in the story of Esther. So he didn't have the full of God, but he was honored by God, even in the meantime, because he feared God. And God still gave him blessings, and he's still willing to bless us as we worship him, as we stay with him. Qoheleth continues, I know that there's nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat, drink, and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. Again, if you're trying to fill in that blank, it's finding a God who fits. So, Qoheleth is everything's meaningless, but he says, I know that there's a purpose. I know that our toil, our work is supposed to carry us to God. But sometimes I struggle. I know we're supposed to find satisfaction in our work, but do we? April 8th, 1966, Time magazine came out with a horrendous title for their magazine, Is God Dead? And they started to examine the Christian movement in the mid-60s. And part of the struggle was that some prominent theologians were starting to have a theology that was devoid of God. And so they were trying to reconcile this with Christianity and everything that we're doing. And they were coming up with this Nietzsche idea that God is dead. And so they started to really examine this thought. And there's two questions. The verse is this: if God is dead, then what is it that has the ability to fill his place in our lives? Okay, I believe you've heard this thought that there's a God-shaped hole in our lives that only God can fill. So if God is dead and God can no longer fill that hole, then what can fill that hole? And the problem is that we know the answer is nothing. There's nothing that will fill that hole. We've tried. We've tried doing it with money, with science, with social welfare, with humanitarian ideas. We've tried to fill that hole with a lot of things, but it just doesn't seem to fill. And part of the issue is that to be happy, to be satisfied, we've got to fill that hole. So if God can't do it, something has to do it. One of the God is dead theologians back a few decades ago was teaching about this, and he was at a university campus, and he was talking about this idea of asking the question, is God dead? And he was actually teaching from 1 Kings 17 and 18, the battle on Carmel with Elijah. And so the theologian said, it just doesn't work like that anymore. You remember the story of Elijah? Elijah comes and he has the prophets of Baal, the prophets of Asherah, and they're up there, 450 of them, and he's up there, and they're going to have a contest, top Mount Carmel. The idea is that they're both going to build an altar, and the God who takes up the altar, he must be the real God. So here's the contest. So Elijah says, you guys go first. They build an altar. That altar was so dry that static electricity would have set it off. They put their sacrifice on it. They begin to pray to Baal, to Asherah, to come and take the sacrifice. And nothing's happening. And so they start to yell louder, because that's what you do. They started to cut themselves so they could get the attention of their God, but their sacrifice is still there. It's not moving. It's not leaving. Elijah, after a while, gets a little bored of this, and so he decides to help them out a little bit. Okay, guys, yell louder. Maybe he's in the bathroom, Maybe he's on vacation. You just need to get a little louder. He'll hear you. Come on. Just do it. You can do it. But nothing happens. Finally, Elijah takes over. He says, find 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Get some wood. Put the wood in the circle of stones, the sacrifice. And then he says, go get some water. So they go and get buckets of water, and they pour the buckets of water over the sacrifice. Elijah digs a trench around the sacrifice. Go get some more water. Not enough. They come back, and they pour more water on it. Elijah looks, says, still not enough. Go get more water. They come back and they put more water on this sacrifice until the trench that he had built around the sacrifice was full of water. And then he prayed. This is his prayer. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you are the God, that you are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. He finishes the prayer. Fire comes down from heaven, takes the sacrifice, takes the wood, licks up all the water that was in the trench. And Elijah won the battle. So this God is dead theologian is there, says, Elijah could do that. We can't do that anymore. It just won't happen. And one of the guys was really brave that was in the lecture. And so he stood up and said, I've got a question. I said, okay, what? Well, what if we did? What do you mean? What if we went outside to the front lawn of the university? What if we built an altar, put some wood in there, doused it with water, prayed for God, and what if fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice? So what then? And the God is dead theologian said, well, then there must be another answer. Because God can't do that. God may have been, but he is no more. And so we're left with this problem with how we fill this void inside of our lives. If God is not here, and our secular society seems to be trying to tell us this, then what can fill that emptiness? Qoheleth says that it's our work. And there's some truth to this. Even Paul to Thessalonians said this, now about your love for one another, we do not need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Paul says, listen, part of your worship of God is that you work with your hands. You mind your own business. We struggle with both of those things sometimes, especially in the church. But this is the gift, according to Qoheleth, this is the gift of God. This is part of why or how God finds meaning, or we find meaning in God. Francis Schaeffer wrote this about Nietzsche. He said, modern people and modern theology, in trying to start from man alone, are left where the brilliant German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche found himself. It skipped on me. Nietzsche in the 1880s was the first one who said in the modern way that God is dead. And he understood well where people end when they say this. If God is dead, then everything for which God gives an answer and meaning is dead. With no personal God, all is dead. Yet man, being truly man, no matter what he says he is, cries out for meaning that can only be found in the existence of an infinite personal God who has not been silent, but has spoken. God's not dead. He can't be, because we need him. We need him to fill that hole. And not only that, but he has spoken in our culture, and he continues to speak if we're willing to listen. But there's a second problem. If God isn't dead, then how does he fit into our lives? If God isn't dead, then what is it that God does in our lives? How do we reconcile a God like the God of Elijah with our modern, contemporary, busy lives? And actually, there are two responses to this. The first is, and you probably realize this, that our lives are full. I know mine is. Our lives are full. They are full of stuff. And so sometimes what we try to do is we try to trim God down so he fits into our lives. But then we're not getting the true God. Then we're just getting a partial God who's been trimmed down, a facsimile that kind of looks like God, but is not really there. And I think for a lot of Christians, that's exactly where we spend our time. We spend our time with this facsimile of God. And we say we're Christians and we're worshiping God, but it's not the full God. It's not God in his fullness. It's not the real God. It's just this God that we've created. I love Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is an atheist, but one of my frustrations with him is that he sets up God in his writings. And then he knocks him down and says, I don't believe in that God. And every time I've read a God that Dawkins has set up, I'm going, well, I don't believe in that God either. That's not the God I believe in. And we seem to do this all over the place. We make something that looks like God, something that will hopefully quell our spirits, but it's not God. Because the alternative to that is hard. The alternative to that is to start clearing out space for God in our lives. In our Bible study this morning, we talked about Micah 6:8, that last phrase, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Walking humbly with God requires that I don't have all the answers, that I'm willing to listen to him. I'm willing to read my Bible, and I'm willing to take answers, that there are things that I don't know. Because as long as I think I know, then I'm not able to walk humbly with God. I just can't. So I got to be willing to step back and say, you know what? I don't know. I don't have all the answers, God, but I want to walk with you. I want to stroll with you. I'm willing to accept new ideas, new ways of looking at your world that you love so much. Help me to walk with you. Because I don't want a facsimile of God in my life. I want God, all of him, in his fullness, filling that place in me that's vacant. One more verse from Ecclesiastes. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. I know we have a real struggle with that one word, the fear of the Lord. Do you fear God? You said that quickly. He's serious. Okay, so I probably online didn't catch that, but let me try to paraphrase. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You don't really walk with God until you begin to fear him, until you become afraid. Because God is powerful? Is that part of it? Okay. He's important. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So God's important. He's amazing and he's awesome. So there's fear involved in that concept. Yeah, sure. I buy that. But we do struggle with the word. And I've had several Christians say, you know what, I don't feel like I fear God. And sometimes I want to say, well, maybe we should. God is all-powerful. God is more than we can probably imagine. Here's what, again, from Ecclesiastes, God has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Part of our struggle, I think, is in defining the word fear. It isn't so much, even as Ray's talking here, it isn't so much that we are afraid of him, but because of his power, we respect him. We have a healthy respect for everything that God does. We trust that what he does will be good, but sometimes in our short-sightedness, it doesn't seem that way. I love the way C.S. Lewis conquers this topic in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When he introduces Aslan, Aslan's a lion in the story, and he's actually an image of Christ. So when you're reading C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia, and you get into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you're reading about Aslan, Aslan is Christ. You need to read the book knowing that Aslan is Christ. And so he's introducing this concept of Aslan, the lion, to some children and a talking beaver. So here's what Lewis writes. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan?" said Mr. Beaver. "Why don't you know he's the king? It is he, not you, that will save Tumnus." Is he a man?" asked Lucy. "Aslan a man?" said Mr. Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you, he's the king of the wood, the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Oh," said Susan, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous meeting a lion." "That you will, oh boy. That you will, dearie. And no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly." Then he isn't safe," said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver is telling you?" "Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." "I'm longing to see him," said Peter, "even if I do feel frightened when it comes to that point." Is God safe? No. But he's good. He wants the best for us, even in our exile. He has a plan that will give us hope and a future that may extend beyond our lives. But while we walk with him here, he continues to give us what we need. He's not safe. Ask any of the prophets. He calls them into things that would make them very uncomfortable. But they trusted that God in his time would carry them through. That God, who is all-powerful, God who is good, would carry them to where God needs them to be. And that's our hope. We don't look at life with the eyes of a human. We look at life with the eyes of a servant underneath the powerful God who we respect, who maybe has set the eternity in our hearts, but we don't quite understand that. Not yet. But we're hoping to someday. We used to sing an old chorus in the church, "In his time." In his time, he makes all things beautiful in his time. Lord, please show me every day that you're teaching me your way, that you do just what you say in your time. God, whatever it is that you want from us, whatever it is you want from us as a congregation, we are willing to trust you, this community, that you will accomplish what you want to accomplish in your time. Whatever you want from me, from us individually, we are willing to trust that you will accomplish what you have set out to do in your time. That you will give us that hope and a future that we want and that we need. That you'll fill that hole that is inside of us if we'll just clean stuff away. See, part of our problem is that we've tried to fill it with other stuff that doesn't work. Qoheleth has a choice. He says everything is meaningless. So either I can eat, drink, and be merry because nothing has meaning except for my pleasure. Or I can run to the arms of a God of meaning and allow him to guide me and to let me walk justly with him. A lot of people have said, you know what? I'm going to pick the first one. Whatever feels good, I'll do that. Whatever numbs the pain, whatever helps me get through the day, whatever lets me get to sleep, that's what I will do. But Qoheleth says that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to chase after the God of meaning. I'm going to wait for his time because I know that he makes all things beautiful in his time. Will you sing that with me? In his time, in his time, he makes all things beautiful in his time. Lord, please show me every day as you're teaching me your way, that you do just what you say in your time. In your time. In your time. You make all things beautiful in your time. Lord, my life to you I bring. May each song I have to sing be to you a lovely thing in your time. Let's pray. Father, we come to you in your time. We have seen you move. We have seen you guide our life. We have seen you take us where we didn't know that we could go. We have seen your blessings. We have felt the terror of this life. But God, we are willing to wait on you. God, help us not to think that we know everything, but be willing to walk justly with you, to love mercy, and to be humble in your presence. God, teach us what it is that you need us to know. Help us not to look too far out into the future, but just stay with you every day. May we be the Daniels of this generation and just keep our eyes focused on you even when everything else is threatening us and wanting to tear our gaze away. We know that you make all things beautiful in your time. And we just want to be part of that process. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
I know there's gonna be some brighter days. I swear that love will find you in your pain. I feel it in me like the beating of life.